The icy air of Arlington National Cemetery cut like thin blades, slipping under coats and uniforms, coiling around the skin of everyone present. The breeze carried the scent of damp grass and freshly turned earth, a cruel reminder that beneath that white marble slab, yet another soldier would rest. The fog crept through the rows of graves, slithering like silent ghosts among the names etched in stone. Each of those names was a story, a sacrifice, an echo of lives taken too soon. Not a subscriber yet? Join our community by clicking subscribe and activate the notification bell to receive alerts for new videos. The sky, heavy and grey, hung over them like a leaden veil. There was no sun that day, and perhaps that was for the best. Light would have only laid bare the grief-stricken faces of those present, the shadows of their losses, the tears held back behind eyes hardened by war. Mourning had a tangible weight in the air, and no words could lighten it. The soldiers of the honor guard, aligned in perfect rows, held their stance with an almost superhuman precision. Their medals, symbols of bravery and sacrifice, gleamed faintly under the muted daylight. They remained motionless, stoic, but in their eyes lay a silent recognition of loss. They knew what it meant to bury one of their own. They knew that war did not end on the battlefield, that sometimes death came later in the corners where no one was looking. In the front row, standing tall with squared shoulders and a perfectly starched dress uniform, was General Nathaniel Carter. His very presence commanded the space, radiating quiet authority and iron discipline. His white gloves contrasted against the deep tone of his dark skin, and his aviator sunglasses concealed eyes that had seen too much. But even without seeing them, anyone who knew him well enough would know they were fixed on the flag-draped coffin, his gaze piercing through the wood as if he could see beyond, as if he was still searching for the man he had considered a brother. Carter had buried soldiers before. He had attended too many funerals, handed too many flags to grieving widows, seen too many children clutch photographs of their fallen parents with desperate longing. But this time was different. This time, the pain was not a distant shadow, not a protocol to be followed. This time, it was personal. Major William Daniels was not just another officer under his command. He was not just another statistic in the casualty reports. Daniels had been his friend, his protégé, someone he had guided since his first day at the military academy. Carter still remembered that first meeting years ago when Daniels was just a young cadet with a freshly issued uniform and eyes gleaming with ambition. "Sir, it is an honor to serve under your command." That young man with a steady voice, a straight back, and the unshakable pride of someone who believed in the purpose of the uniform he wore. Carter had watched him in silence for a moment before giving him a firm pat on the shoulder. "The honor will be mine if you prove yourself worthy of it." And he had. Daniels had grown, had become a leader, an admirable soldier, a man Carter came to see as part of his own family. Until an improvised explosive device, buried in the dust of a foreign desert, took him away without warning. Now, all that was left of him was the coffin in front of Carter. Daniel's widow, standing beside the funeral casket, clutched the folded flag with such force that her knuckles trembled. Her lips quivered, but she made no sound. Her tears fell silently, slipping down her pale cheeks as her fingers traced the fabric with an almost desperate devotion, as if touching it could bring back what she had lost. Carter watched her for a moment, feeling something he could not describe. A weight in his chest, a pressure in his ribs that was not just sorrow, but contained rage. Rage against an unjust fate, against a war that continued to claim lives, against a system that saw soldiers as replaceable parts in an endless machine of combat. But now was not the time for that anger. He took a deep breath, steadying his thoughts, forcing his body to remain firm. He could not afford to break. Not here. The bugle sounded, and the mournful notes of taps rose among the tombstones. Carter closed his eyes for a brief second, allowing the melody to envelop him, letting each note become a silent farewell. Click subscribe and activate notifications. That way, you'll always be up to date with our latest videos and won't miss anything. The rifle salute shattered the air, each shot resonating with the harshness of reality. 21 gunshots, 21 sharp cracks that punctured the silence, that made the hearts of those present tremble. It was the final tribute, the last goodbye, and then there was only silence. The moment had come. Carter took a deep breath, preparing to step forward. He adjusted his gloves, squared his shoulders, and advanced with the solemnity of a man who carried the weight of countless deaths upon his back. But then, the peace of the funeral was shattered. Sharp voice, as cutting as a blade, sliced through the cold air. "Get down! Hands where I can see them!" Time seemed to freeze. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. Carter turned slowly, his mind analyzing the situation with the lethal precision of a soldier in combat. 2 police officers stood at the edge of the ceremony, legs firmly planted, weapons drawn, pointed directly at him. The younger one, a rookie, with a pale face and fingers trembling over his pistol, seemed hesitant. But the other, a stocky, middle-aged man with a furrowed brow and a face hardened by arrogance, had no doubt whatsoever. It was a look Carter knew all too well. The air in the cemetery grew even heavier. The wind stopped blowing. No one moved. General Nathaniel Carter, 4 stars on his shoulders, a decorated war hero, a veteran, found himself once again staring down the barrel of a gun. But this time, he wasn't on the battlefield. He was on American soil. And this time, the only threat was the color of his skin. The echo of the command reverberated through the frozen air like a muffled explosion. For a moment, reality fragmented into a series of disjointed instants. Carter didn't move. No one did. Only the wind dared to slip between the trees, rustling the dry leaves scattered over the damp grass. Then a ripple of uneasy murmurs spread through the attendees. "What the hell?" whispered an honor guard officer, barely audible. The soldiers, still standing in perfect formation, exchanged incredulous glances. Some instinctively twitched toward their sides, reaching for weapons that weren't there. They had come to a funeral, not a battlefield. Carter, bearing the weight of every gaze upon him, held his rigid stance, his expression hidden behind aviator sunglasses. He didn't blink. He showed no fear. He only watched. The 2 officers aiming at him stood a few meters away, both clad in pristine local police uniforms. But there was a fundamental difference between them. The first, a young man with blonde hair and a tight jaw, looked nervous. His hand trembled ever so slightly over the grip of his gun. His blue eyes flickered between Carter and the crowd, as if searching for a justification for what was happening. The second, however, had no doubts. He was a stocky man, his face lined with the marks of a misunderstood sense of authority. He had broad shoulders, a prominent jaw, and the cold eyes of someone who had already made his decision before arriving. His badge gleamed on his chest, but what stood out most was the way he gripped his weapon, with the certainty of a man who believed he had absolute control over the situation. His name, stitched into the fabric of his uniform, briefly caught the dull light of the day. Sergeant Doug Harper. I said, "Get on the ground." "Now," Harper repeated, his voice heavier, laden with something more than authority. It wasn't an order, it was a threat. Carter exhaled slowly, with the composure of a man who had been in far more dangerous situations than this. But this time, something was different. He wasn't in a war zone surrounded by insurgents. He was in his own country, at the funeral of a fallen soldier. And in front of him stood an enemy he couldn't shoot, but one who could shoot him without a second. Thought Daniel's widow let out a strangled sob. "What's happening?" someone in the crowd murmured. The sound of metal tightening echoed through the air as Harper's finger edged dangerously close to the trigger. "Last warning," he growled. "Get on the ground." The silence became thick, unbearable. Carter let it hang for a few more seconds, allowing the uncertainty to seep into everyone's bones. Then he spoke. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. But it carried the weight of a man used to being obeyed. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Sergeant?" The younger officer, the rookie, swallowed visibly. Harper, however, barely blinked. "I don't ask questions. I give orders." Carter tilted his head just slightly. Something in his posture, in the way he kept his back straight and his hands at his sides, as if he were the one in control of the situation, sent a shiver through more than one soldier in the crowd. But Harper didn't see it, or chose not to. "I warned you, asshole. Hands up or I'll shoot." There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, not in the wind, not in the distant hum of traffic beyond the cemetery gates, but in the tension winding tighter between everyone witnessing the scene. One of the soldiers, a lieutenant with a face hardened by war, took a step forward, his jaw clenched. "Have you lost your damn mind, Sergeant?" he said, his voice low but firm. Harper didn't look away. "Step back, Lieutenant. This doesn't concern you." The lieutenant didn't even blink. "You're aiming your gun at a 4-star general in the middle of a military funeral," he spat, disbelief dripping from every word. "Do you have any idea what that means?" Silence was the only answer. Harper didn't respond, but the flicker of hesitation in his eyes was enough. Beside him, the young officer, Bradley according to his name tag, looked on the verge of crumbling under the weight of the moment. "Sergeant, I think we're making a mistake," he murmured, his voice shaking with every word. Harper didn't even turn his head. "Shut your mouth, Bradley." But Bradley didn't. Because he knew. He knew there was no reason for Harper to be doing this. He knew there was no threat. He knew the only justification for his superior standing there, gun raised, was that the man he was aiming at had darker skin than his own. And in that moment, Bradley made the worst possible decision a lower-ranking officer could make in front of a man like Harper. He stepped in. With a single stride, he placed himself between his sergeant and Carter, his hands raised in a gesture of peace, his blue eyes filled with genuine fear. "Sergeant, please, lower your weapon." The tension reached its breaking point. Carter didn't move. Harper looked at him, but he didn't see a decorated general, a man with an unblemished record of service. No, Harper only saw a black man daring to defy him. "I give the orders here," he growled through clenched teeth. Carter, with the patience of a man who knew exactly what was about to happen, barely inclined his head. His voice was a blade-thin whisper. "No, Sergeant, you don't." And then everything collapsed. Time seemed to freeze in that instant. Bradley, his breath uneven, sweat gathering at his brow, stood firm between his superior and General Carter. His uniform, which until that day had been a symbol of pride, now felt like a prison. He couldn't step back. He knew what Harper was doing was wrong, but he also knew that defying him could cost him everything. Harper, on the other hand, didn't even flinch. The hatred in his eyes was a chained beast, trembling, ready to strike. His finger moved a millimeter further on the trigger. The atmosphere became suffocating. The sound of soldiers holding their breath mixed with the crunch of grass beneath Carter's boots as he finally took a step forward. That single movement made several muscles tense in the crowd. The sound of a boot impacting damp earth shouldn't have meant anything, but in that moment, it meant everything. Harper barely blinked. He didn't lower the weapon. Carter, however, didn't stop. Another step. More murmurs of unease rippled through the crowd. Another step. Daniels's widow sobbed softly, her fingers clenched over the folded flag. Another step. Now Carter was close enough that Harper could see his own face reflected in the general's dark lenses. Then Carter spoke. "Sergeant Harper." His voice was barely a whisper, but his tone was razor-sharp. Harper clenched his jaw. "Don't take another step." The shout tore through the air, shattering the silence with palpable violence. His hand trembled for just a second. Carter tilted his head. "Tell me, Sergeant." His voice didn't change, didn't rise even a single note. "Do you know who I am?" The tremor in Harper's hand became more pronounced. "I don't give a damn who you are," he spat. "When I give an order, it gets obeyed." Carter let out a faint exhale, as if the response didn't surprise him at all, as if he had expected it. Then he inclined his head, his next question falling with the weight of a death sentence. "Do you know what it means to point a gun at a four-star general on American soil?" A shiver ran through the crowd. The lieutenant who had spoken earlier tensed. A captain beside him inhaled sharply, his eyes darting between Harper and Carter in utter disbelief. The murmurs swelled like a rising tide. The air shifted. Harper felt the change. Finally, he hesitated. His eyes drifted to Carter's chest, where 4 silver stars gleamed with a muted brilliance. 4 stars. 4 stars that meant power, authority. A man who answered directly to the President of the United States. 4 stars that meant Harper had made the worst mistake of his life. The color drained from his face. "No, no, that can't be," he whispered, his voice barely audible. And that's when he heard it. The growing murmur of the soldiers, the witnesses to his mistake, the same ones now watching his downfall in real time. The captain to his left no longer saw him as a fellow officer. Want more content like this? Then hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because there's always new content here, and you won't want to miss out. The lieutenant to his right no longer saw a superior, but a man who was already finished. Young Bradley no longer saw a leader. And the worst part, Daniels' widow, who hadn't spoken a single word, looked at him. Her eyes were still red from crying, but her expression was no longer just grief. It was contempt. Harper felt the weight of the moment crush him. Sweat trickled down his neck. His breathing grew ragged. The gun in his hand now felt as heavy as lead. Then, for the last time, he heard Carter's voice. "Sergeant, lower your weapon. Now." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a threat. It was an order. And this time Harper obeyed. His fingers loosened. The gun fell to the ground with a dull thud. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel in a court-martial. In that instant, everything changed, because barely a second later, the 2 military police officers moved in. Their motions were swift, trained, efficient. One of them grabbed Harper's right wrist. The other twisted his arm behind his back, with enough force to make it clear that he had no options left. "Sergeant Doug Harper, you are under arrest." The soldiers watched in absolute silence. Harper struggled. "No, you can't do this." But they could, and they were. The handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists with a final unyielding click. "Wait, this is a mistake." Carter said nothing. He only watched. Harper turned his head desperately, looking for support. But he found none. Young Bradley no longer looked at him, didn't recognize him. The lieutenant averted his gaze. He wanted nothing to do with him. The captain only shook his head, as if Harper no longer existed. Harper made one last attempt. His breath came in frantic bursts as he locked eyes with Carter. "General, sir, please." But it was too late, because Nathaniel Carter had only 2 words for him. "Take him away." Harper screamed. He resisted. He fought, but it no longer mattered. The crowd watched as he was dragged away between the tombstones. The clinking of his handcuffs against his uniform was the last echo of his downfall, and for the first time throughout the entire ordeal, Carter finally took a breath. Harper's silhouette disappeared among the gravestones as the military police officers dragged him toward the patrol car parked at the cemetery entrance. The echo of his voice still lingered in the air, his desperate pleas dissolving into the vastness of Arlington. But no one did anything, no one intervened, no one defended him. Sergeant Doug Harper, the man who, just minutes earlier, had wielded a weapon with absolute confidence, no longer existed. His name, his uniform, his badge, everything that once symbolized authority was now nothing more than the dust of a ruined career. The sound of the patrol car's engine roared in the distance, and within seconds, Harper became nothing more than a memory. But the wound he had opened in that place remained. For a moment, silence ruled the cemetery, an uncomfortable, dense, corrosive silence. No one dared to speak, because everyone knew that what they had just witnessed should never have happened. Carter didn't move immediately. His posture remained firm, his face impassive behind his dark glasses. But inside him, something pulsed with intensity. It wasn't anger, it wasn't pride, it was exhaustion. Exhaustion from seeing the same story repeat itself over and over again. He had been in more battles than he could count. He had faced enemies on war-torn fields, survived ambushes, watched younger men fall, men with dreams still intact. But this battle, the one he had faced that day in his own country, had no end. A man can dodge bullets, he can evade explosives, but he cannot dodge the prejudices sown across generations. He took a deep breath and slowly turned toward Daniel's widow. She was still there, clutching the folded flag tightly against her chest. Her eyes, swollen from crying, met his with something more than gratitude. Respect. Carter didn't say anything. He didn't need to. With a slight nod, he gave her the recognition she deserved, and, with the same solemnity with which he had stood there all that time, he took a step back. He turned toward the honor guard's bugler, resumed the ceremony. The soldier nodded, placed the instrument against his lips, and let the first note of taps rise into the air. The sound drifted among the tombstones between the rigid bodies of the soldiers in formation, between the hearts clenched by what they had just witnessed. Carter closed his eyes for a moment, not for Harper, not for himself, but for Daniels, because this moment was never supposed to be about anything other than honoring a man who had given his life for his country. The final note of the bugle faded into the wind. The funeral had come to an end, and then the news exploded like gunpowder across the country. On the headlines of every network, in newspapers, on social media, Harper's name became synonymous with disgrace. CNN. Scandal in Arlington sergeant. Arrested for pointing a gun at a general during military ceremony. NBC News. Racism in the armed forces. General Carter breaks his silence. The Washington Post. An isolated case or a symptom of something bigger? Every channel played the same footage on repeat. The video, captured by one of the funeral attendees, went viral within hours. The entire world saw Harper in his pristine uniform, gripping a gun, his finger hovering dangerously over the trigger. The entire world saw Carter, standing firm, motionless, staring death in the eyes without flinching. The entire world heard the sound of the gun hitting the ground. The entire world heard the snap of the handcuffs locking around the sergeant's wrists, but most importantly, the entire world understood what had happened. Harper went from being a decorated officer to the face of abuse of power in the military. His career ended immediately. The internal investigation revealed a troubling record. Prior complaints of racial profiling, all dismissed. Testimonies from black soldiers who described him as a hostile man, someone it was better not to cross paths with. Evidence of excessive use of force in situations where there had never been a real threat. The military had no choice. 2 days after the incident, Harper's official dismissal was announced. The statement was brief, cold, direct. Sergeant Doug Harper has been relieved of his duties, effective immediately. He's currently facing judicial proceedings under military jurisdiction for misconduct, abuse of authority, and improper use of force. Television analysts debated whether Harper would face criminal charges. Some were certain he would. Others argued that the system would find a way to protect him. The truth was, regardless of what happened, his name would be stained forever, and the worst part for him wasn't the possibility of prison. It was the fact that he had been exposed. He was no longer a man with power. He was a man undone. The Pentagon was forced to respond. The questions became impossible to avoid. How many more like Harper were still within the ranks of the military? How many high-ranking officers had ignored the warning signs? How long had these abuses been allowed to continue? The press conferences were filled with evasions. The United States military is an institution of honor and respect. We have taken immediate action. We do not tolerate discrimination in any form. But the reality was different. The Arlington incident had shone a light on a problem that had been buried for decades, and what unsettled the military leadership the most was that this time the scandal wasn't going to fade away. Nathaniel Carter gave no interviews. He turned down every request from the media. He didn't appear on television. He made no public statements. He didn't want to be a symbol because he had been through this before. This wasn't the first time he had faced racism within the military. This wasn't the first time he had seen a white man with a gun in his hand, believing he could use it with impunity. This wasn't the first time he had asked himself how much more he would have to endure. 3 days after the funeral, Carter stood in his office, gazing out at the city through the massive window. From there, he could see the memorial to the fallen. He could see the names carved into the stone. Thousands of names, thousands of stories. He closed his eyes for a second and let out a breath. He had been a soldier all his life. He had crossed oceans. He had fought in wars. He had buried more brothers than he could remember, and yet his greatest battle was at home. Outside, the television remained on, muted. News headlines scrolled one after another across the screen. Harper's dismissal, real. Change or just a superficial measure? Experts analyze structural racism within the military. What will General Carter do next? That last question made his jaw tighten. What would he do next? He walked slowly toward his desk and opened a folder of documents. On the cover, in bold letters, it read, "Report on Discrimination in the Armed Forces." It was a report he had tried to make public 10 years ago. No one listened. No one wanted to pay attention. But now the country was watching, and if the system wasn't ready to change, Carter was ready to force it. The problem had never been Harper. Harper was just a symptom. The problem was the system that allowed men like him to feel untouchable. The problem was the countless soldiers who, like Daniels, had given their lives for a country that still hadn't learned to respect them. Carter had no illusions. He knew the road ahead was long. He knew that what had happened in Arlington wouldn't be the last time. But what he also knew was that he wasn't going to stop, not on the battlefield, not in Washington, not anywhere. Because if there was one thing he had learned in his life, it was that some wars aren't won with bullets. They're won with resilience. And he was ready to keep fighting. If this story inspired you, leave a like to support the channel and subscribe for more content like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapters. And let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from every corner of the world our channel reaches.